When you were young and your parents took you to the zoo and you saw a bunch of animals for the very first time, it's very likely that you saw some animals that looked very similar to one another, and you immediately grouped them together in your mind as if these organisms are the same type of organism. For example, you may have seen a flying squirrel in a cage, and then maybe in another cage, either next to it or maybe on the other side of the zoo, you might have seen an Australian animal called a sugar glider. These two organisms look very similar. And if we were to use the language that I'm going to use in this talk, if we're simply looking at organisms or species as book covers, we might say these two books are the same thing. They must include the same information because what I see looks identical to my eyes. And yet your eyes can deceive you. Organisms are not all as similar as they may look. And organisms that look different may not be as different as they first seem. Answers in Genesis speakers Georgia Purdom and Ken Ham are not children looking at organisms for the very first time. And yet sometimes it feels like they are because the way they describe what they're seeing. It is as if they're describing the differences between organisms based on solely what they see with their eyes on sort of first visual inspection of organisms. And I'm going to show you an example of that today from a recent talk by Georgia Purdom, where Georgia Purdom is presenting a look at these books, look at their covers. What are we to understand from that if you don't look underneath the hood? Let's talk about that coming up. Welcome back. My name's Joel Duff, and if you were with me for my last video, you'll know that I've already talked about Georgia Purdom, who's an employee at Answers in Genesis, the young earth creationist apologetics ministry of Ken Ham. Recently, she gave a seminar as part of a creation conference in Sweden earlier this year. And there she gave a approximately 1 hour talk on this title, Where Did All the Animals Come From? Understanding Animal Kinds and Speciation, where she outlines the young earth creationist model of the origins of biological diversity. From the created kinds to how they diversified after the flood into many, many different species. She presents a model of how that speciation happens. And then she makes a case for the rate of speciation that young earth creationists believe that species have been appearing on this earth over time. Evolving on this earth over time. And in that talk, she presented a couple slides that I said I would reserve for their own special attention here, and here we are. So let me just show you a couple of her slides and give you a brief synopsis of what she has said about them, and then we will discuss. Here we have this slide titled Species and Breeds of, and something went wrong with her slides there. Not even sure what the next word should be, but there was a formatting problem. But we get the gist. Species and breeds. There's 35 species of dogs, she claims. Okay, not going to quibble with that. 338 breeds of Canis lupus. Now, Canis lupus is the scientific name for wolves. And most taxonomists would consider all domesticated dogs to be a subspecies of Canis lupus, or a variety. So you'd have Canis lupus subspecies or variety familiaris. I can't say that in Latin, which is the domesticated dogs that are actually, in fact, part of the wolf species. So 338 breeds contained within that. Then she makes this statement. There's greater diversity among breeds than species. Right? Just take it on the face of it. And she says this just very matter-of-factly. There's greater diversity among breeds of domesticated dogs than there are among species of canines. Now, the focus of what we're going to talk about here is going to be about this word diversity. What does she mean by diversity? And for me, it's important to think about what does the audience think she means by diversity? Because that's the message she's trying to communicate to a particular audience. She's trying to use these words to convince them of a particular aspect of the young earth creationist views of speciation. So it's important to understand not only what she thinks diversity is, but how she's portraying this term to an audience and how they might understand it. And then she proceeds to show this figure right after this. All right. So she's saying there's more diversity within breeds than there is between species, or between breeds than there is between species. And she says, look, you have a gray wolf and you have coyotes. Again, there's a formatting error here. So covat is, that's coyote. Great wolf. And then this is a Great Dane. Let me get my pen out. So we have the Great Dane and we have the Yorkshire Terrier. And she proceeds to tell us that the Great Dane and the Yorkshire Terrier are different, obviously very different from one another, whereas the gray wolf and the coyote are very similar looking. And therefore, right, so the conclusion of what we're seeing with our eyes is that Great Danes and Yorkshire Terriers are more diverse, all right? And that even has the connotation of they're more divergent from each other, more different from each other. And the gray wolf and the coyote are very similar looking organisms, and therefore they're not as different from one another. So gray wolves and coyotes are different species, and she acknowledges that. Great Danes and Yorkshire Terriers are simply breeds of an organism of one species, and yet they're very divergent or different from one another. Now, I have a lot of problems with the way she says this and what she's presenting and what she's trying to get her audience to think about this and believe about this particular statement. But rather than tell you what she's saying, I think it's important that I read her words. So I've taken the transcript from this YouTube video. And so I want to read exactly what she's saying so you can judge whether I am my interpretation of her words. So we're going to look at dogs again because they're just the easiest thing for us to use. So there's 35 species of dogs in the world and 338 breeds of domesticated dogs. Okay, so all domesticated dogs are the same species, but there's different breeds. But there's 35 species of dog total, including the wild dogs. Now you have greater diversity. Now here it comes. Now you see, I think is probably what she meant to say there. Now you see greater diversity among breeds than you do among species. And again, she has this figure on the screen as she's saying this. All right, so let me show you this. So which of these things is not like the other? Oh, actually, she brings up the slide now. And then she proceeds to show this slide. Which one of these things is not like the other? And of course, the Great Danes and the Yorkshire Terriers are the most different looking things on the slide. And so our audience is supposed to say or think to themselves, oh, Great Danes, Yorkshire Terriers, look how different they are. Different colors, different shapes, different ears, different length of legs. You know, they have a tremendous amount of diversity. And the coyote and the wolf are kind of like, just look like variations of each other on a theme. So what does she say? She says, so the gray wolf, the Great Dane, and the Yorkshire Terrier. Now, they look pretty different, right? But we all know they're dogs, right? It would have been better to say canines. But so we all know that they're dogs. But they look pretty different. But they're all in the same species. They're Canis lupus. But the coyote, which looks an awful lot like the wolf, is a different species. He's Canis latrans, right? He's a different species. So 3 of these things look very different from one another, and yet they're lumped together in the same species. Here's this other thing that looks very similar to a wolf, but it's really a different species. So what we're saying again, there's much more diversity among the breeds of dogs, like the Great Dane and the Yorkshire Terrier, than there are even between species, like the wolf and the coyote, which look pretty similar, right? But they're completely different species. What is it? This is a very confusing message. I think this would be very confusing to an audience if they don't have any background in biology and especially in taxonomy, right? Okay, so you're saying these things are the same species, but they look really similar, and these other things aren't a species. You might wonder, like, how and why are you calling those different species? Now, she had talked a little bit earlier about biological classification and a little bit about like their primary criteria for different species, which would be the ability to breed with one another. But of course, coyotes and wolves can, to some extent, breed with each other. And of course, domesticated dogs and wolves can too. So I'm not sure what the audience is thinking at this particular point. They've just been told before this that all canines are the same kind. And therefore, they're all descendants of they would be descendants of two canines that were on Noah's Ark. And so all this diversity has to be packed into all this diversity of 35 different species, plus all these different breeds, have to be packed into those two different dogs which are on the Ark. And that's the thing she's trying to explain in this talk about her speciation rates and so forth. Not going to go all into that because I just made a video about that, and you can watch me talk about that, the whole speciation rate thing. Let's continue here, though. And so what do we think about that? When we think about that, if humans can create several hundred breeds that are very distinctive looking, and most of the breeds that we have today have only come into existence in the last 500 years or so, they haven't been really around that long, and that's through people selecting for and against certain traits and breeding them. All right, so in this bit of stuff from Purdom, we learned that, oh, look, how did those breeds become so different? Now she turns to, look, they haven't been around that long. Everybody knows that. Like, everybody acknowledges that some of these breeds have fairly short-lived, right? They've only been around for hundreds of years. Some have been around for thousands, but some of these for hundreds of years. And how did they get that way? Most everyone understands they got their way through human beings doing artificial selecting. I like this character. And then basically teasing out variation from wolf characteristics in order to make these very distinctive looking breeds. If we can do that in just a few hundred years, though, like I say, artificial selection, people selecting for that genetic diversity, then why don't we, or why can't we, believe that natural processes acting on the genetic diversity that God created produce different species, and if in a few, I think that should have been in a few thousand years. Hey, look, if we can make all these really diverse and even more divergent species or breeds by doing selection, which we artificially pull out different features in organisms over just a few hundred years, and then you look at all these other species and they're like, they're not that different, right? In fact, they look more similar. They're less different than these breeds are from one another. We could make these breeds in just a few hundred years. It's not that shocking that natural selection, can do it over a few thousand years. After all, nature's got a couple thousand years. Now, maybe nature isn't as efficient as human beings because they're not maybe specifically picking only one or few characters. And so maybe it's not as fast as human beings are at making breeds. But there's only 35 species, and they're not all that different looking. So what's the challenge here? What's the difficulty here? Why couldn't we say that there was just two animals on the ark? They had some variation, and then natural processes resulted in 35 different species. And we've just taken one of them and sort of plucked out 385 different breeds from that because human beings are even smarter than natural selection, and we just made a whole bunch more. All right. Just one. I think I only have one more slide. Then we'll talk about this. Right. Only we can have created hundreds of breeds of dogs in 500 years. I jumped the gun on that, right? Only we can have created hundreds of breeds of dogs in 500 years. Yeah, she's acknowledging that, like, out there in nature, you wouldn't come up with 500 different breeds in just 500 years, or hundreds of breeds in just 500 years. Okay, through our own selecting for or against certain traits, so it's totally plausible to believe that we could have 35 species of dogs. Just a few dozen in a few thousand years, though, through natural processes that are going on out there in nature. What's going on out there in nature? Natural selection, genetic drift, some mutations, gene flow being stopped, all the process, all the mechanisms of how organisms change and adapt to their environment over time. Those are the natural mechanisms going on. Yeah, it's not hard to believe there could have been 35 different species of dogs. All right, problem number one. All right, problem number one before I go back here and summarize. You remember from the last video, Georgia Purdom, to her audience, is presenting this as if there's natural selection only needs to come up with 35 species. And if we can come up with hundreds in just a couple hundred years, that's no problem. What I said in the last video was, though, she's completely ignoring extinction. I went and looked, and there's about 200 different named species, extinct species of canines. Right? So you have 35, you have to add 200 to that. And you could quibble with some of those names. You could say, like, some of those, maybe they're not really distinct species and maybe they'll be lumped together. But you have to recognize that there are probably many species we haven't yet discovered in the fossil record. We're always finding new stuff, and we only have a very small snapshot of all the organisms that have ever lived, because many of them may have never left a fossil to begin with for us to find. So I think 200 would be a very minimal number of other canines that have existed. And all 200 of those canines are found in sediments that are in what Georgia Purdom would recognize as being post-flood sediments. So all those different species have lived since the two canines got off the ark. And so two canines, two individuals, would have had to give rise to 235 different species over 4,000 years. That is a much faster pace of speciation than she is acknowledging, or I'll say trivializing, right, in her talk, acting like this is no big deal. But what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a second very serious problem, misconception, really lie to the audience by Georgia Purdom and Ken Ham, how they present this idea of speciation by trivializing the number of differences or the actual differences between different organisms, by using this apples to orange comparison of breeds versus species. And so let me just remind you, here's their bullet points. After she says all that, she's going back and doing a really quick recap. Species and breeds. If humans can create several hundred breeds that are very distinctive looking, lots of emphasis on how different these things are, in just a few hundred years, using artificial selection, natural processes acting on genetic diversity can certainly create several dozen species in a few thousand years since the flood. All right, she's convinced natural processes, they can certainly create dozens of species in just a few thousand years. Okay, where do we go from here? I want to give you another example of this misconception and this apples to oranges comparison. This, what I think is I try not to use the word lie, but it's hard for me to come up with another word that doesn't really fit this, because it's one thing for Ken Ham to say it. It's another thing for Georgia Purdom to talk about differences and being more different, and her being a geneticist, and not following that up with an acknowledgement to the audience that looks can be deceiving. That all I'm doing is just looking at external appearance, and I'm just showing you and trying to make you think these things are really different, when in fact, by most measures, they're not. All right, so let me show you this other example. And it comes from my paper published a few years ago with my co-authors, Thomas Beaton and David McMullen III, and in which we're talking about hyper-rapid speciation and critiquing the super fast speciation rate that Answers in Genesis and other creationists are promoting in the last 20 years. And so in that article, I include this tweet that's a figure in my paper. And it's a figure from Ken Ham. It's actually one of the figures that partially inspired writing the article itself. Here we have Ken Ham saying, "The wolf and the coyote are different species. And evolutionists claim this took thousands of years." Well, actually, I would say evolutionists think that based on the fossil record, that this took somewhere between maybe 400,000 and 700,000 years to divide wolves and coyotes from one another, or that coyotes are known from fossils that are in excess of 500,000 years old. So potentially they're as much as 1,000,000 years old even. Right, so he's underreporting that, right? Look, evolutionists say this took thousands of years. to happen. Yet the differences between a Great Dane and a Yorkshire Terrier, see where Georgia Purwood got her stuff from? This is just all recycled material from just a few individuals at Answers in Genesis that come up with these slides, and then everybody else reads them and uses them and talks about them. And so they perpetuate the errors over and over and over again. Yet the differences between the Great Dane and the Yorkshire Terrier are much greater. All right? Saying the coyote and the wolf are different species. And then he is saying, don't miss this, he is saying the difference between a Great Dane and a Yorkshire Terrier are much greater. The differences are much greater between them and those other species. But they are the same species, and we know were bred in the last few hundred years. So if these two animals were bred and could be bred in the last couple hundred years, and so both of those breeds have come to be in the past couple hundred years, and they're that different from one another, well, then of course evolution is bankrupt, right? Because these organisms, all these other 35 species that kind of look similar to one another, at least several of them look really similar to each other. Who's to say they're not a couple hundred years old? We'll give them a couple thousand years because we have a couple thousand years. We got 4,500 years. All right. So what's wrong with this? Why am I so exasperated? Why am I sighing? It's because this is such a gross simplification of the differences between these organisms. This truly is reading the book simply by its cover. You're simply looking at the organisms saying, oh, one's big and one's small. One has a different coat color. One has flop ears, one has ears standing upright. So you can count up a number of characteristics that are different from one another, and you can't necessarily see as dramatic differences between the wolf and the coyote. Those differences are relatively minor differences with respect to the totality of the whole organism's identity. All right, and I'm going to try to show you that in a moment here. Well, let's start out right now. A while back, I did a quick analysis, right? This is many years ago. It's on my blog, and like Georgia Purdom has seen my blog. And so she's perfectly aware of this data. I know that she knows this, about this, which is why it's especially exasperating for her to talk in the way she does to her audience, which is naive to that evidence. She's not presenting them a full orb view of just what divergence is between organisms and how much genetic divergence there is and the totality of the differences that there are between different species versus breeds of organisms. There's a reason why taxonomists call things breeds and subspecies and not recognize them as different species, even though two organisms may look very different. Two individual organisms may look very different. So what I did a while back, just as a quick little survey, I downloaded 1,000 mitochondrial genomes. So that's your little genome that's inside your mitochondrion. And it's about 16,000 base pairs long. Really, it's about that size in all mammals. And so I downloaded 800 domesticated dogs. A lot of them have been sequenced because a lot of people are interested in dog breeds and the relationships to each other. So I took those 800 along with a couple hundred other species, including foxes, and you see wild dogs, coyotes, Tibetan wolf, which is sort of a divergent version of wolves that some people might think is a different species. And then old world wolves and new world wolves, Canis lupus, and then those 800 domesticated dogs. And I simply used a database to align all those sequences up with each other, and then asked a computer to do a little phylogenetic tree. Actually, this is just a distance tree. So this is just asking the computer, put sequences together that are most similar, and then draw lines representing the amount of genetic difference between the two. So let's see what we've got here. Now, first I want to show you, here's coyotes. So there was a number of different coyotes included. These would be coyotes all over North America because that's where coyotes are from, whereas wolves are over a large portion of the world. And so what you see is there's actually a good amount of differences between different coyotes, right? There's dozens and dozens, up to, we'll say, 70 or 80 differences out of 16,000 in their genetic code for the mitochondrial genome. So this is coyotes. And yet it's very clear that all coyotes are very similar to one another because you have to travel way far back. And this is hundreds of differences, genetic differences, to find the common ancestor or the point at which they would share a sequence with then the descendants, eventual descendants of the wolves and the domesticated dogs. All right, so notice the diversity in coyotes. And then there is Tibetan wolves, which are quite distinct, right, from coyotes and also distinct from wolves. And then we have wolves. Now, I actually have this mislabeled here. Most of the wolves are in this region right here. And there's a few oddballs that have these long branches. But for the most part, here's the wolf diversity, Old World and New World wolf diversity, along with a few domesticated dogs mixed in here. So some of the oldest versions of domesticated dogs, oldest lineages. And then down here, what we have is lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of domesticated dogs. Now, what I'm not going to show you is there's 800 of them here, and you're only seeing about 100 of them here. But I do not need to show you the rest of this file. Because it looks identical to what you're seeing here. They're all pretty much along, each one of these little, you see these little tiny nubs right here? Each one represents a different species. And there is actually a tiny little branch there for some of them. And the branch might represent 1 or 2 or maybe 3 differences. All right. So if you traveled from here all the way down to here and you looked at one of these, they're basically on the same line. And then it says you have essentially the same mitochondrial genome, and you might have 1 or 2 or 3 differences from these other ones. And so you can go down 800 domesticated dogs, and guess what? There's a Great Dane in there, and there's a Terrier in there, and there's a Chihuahua in there, right? And there's a Mastiff in there, and there is a Golden Doodle in there. Well, actually, probably not a Golden Doodle in there. That's a mixed breed. And their mitochondrial genomes are all almost identical to one another. Now, what does that tell you? What that tells you is that all domesticated dogs have a similar origin. They're all related to one another. Now, there's a lot of disputes about how many times dogs were domesticated, but they were domesticated from similar wolves. And those wolves didn't live that long ago, so their mitochondrial genomes were not that different from one another. So it's hard to pull apart the domesticated dogs just with mitochondrial DNA. The point is that if domesticated dogs, the reason they're not all that different from one another in terms of their genetics, in terms of their mitochondrial genome in this case, is that they've only been separated from one another for 1,000 years to 15,000 years. There's some recent evidence that maybe even 30,000 years ago since the domestication of wolves. But let's just put it in the young Earth timeline. In the young Earth timeline, all domesticated dogs are only, max 4,500 years old, right? And since they clearly are just a subset of wolves, right? Wolves are more diverse. Right here, you see this? See the lines? They're longer lines here. That suggests wolves have been around longer. And the reason I say that is because the mitochondrial genome is going to accumulate mutations over time. This is the same way you can look at human beings. You and I might have 50 or 60 differences. And yet, if we're all traced back to, one mother, we all had the exact same mitochondrial genome at one time. And so any differences between you and me are mutations that have accumulated over time. And so the more differences there are between me and you, it's likely the more distant we'd have to go back to find our common ancestor, right? We all have that common ancestor at some point, but some of us share a common ancestor more recently. So for domesticated dogs, they're all almost the same. They share a recent common ancestor, or at least share a pool of similar wolves, all right, in the not too distant past. And for me, I would say not too distant past could be 15 to 20,000 years. And that amount of genetic diversity, that's about right. Mitochondrial genome is not changing that fast in different animal lineages. All right, so you've got wolves. I would go back to my point. Wolves have much more genetic diversity. That suggests they've been around longer. They've been separated into subgroups of different wolves. They don't, and they each are following different lineages, but you have to trace them way back. You can say well, maybe you're tracing wolves back to Noah's Ark for young Earth creationists. Well, no, that can't be because there's 35 other species of living canines. And they have many more differences, all right? There's lots of difference between them and coyotes. And there's a lot more differences between Asian wild dogs. And there's a lot more differences between foxes. In fact, there's over 2,000 differences in the mitochondrial genome between a fox and a wolf. 2,000 differences. It's an enormous number. That's more than the differences between humans and chimpanzees. So you have an enormous amount of genetic diversity that's being formed. And if they were only started as a single mitochondrial genome on Noah's Ark, right? If there was a pair and there was a female and a male, a canine on Noah's Ark, there was only one mitochondrial or one form of mitochondrial genome there. And so all this genetic diversity has to have occurred via mutations occurring in the descendants since stepping off the ark. And what you have is subset after subset after subset after subset, and you eventually get down to coyotes and wolves. They had to have come later. And then within the wolves had to exist, and they've already existed for a long time because there's a lot of genetic diversity in wolves. And out of them, out of a small pocket of wolves, comes your domesticated dogs. Now, if this all sounds pretty crazy, I think it kind of is. It really doesn't make any sense because, for one thing, you can go back even in the Bible, and it's pretty clear there were domesticated dogs pretty early on, right? That is contrary to the rates of speciation and the rates at which mutations would occur in this creationist model to give us the results we're seeing here. All right, so summarizing. All domesticated dogs are virtually the same. Oh, now let's go back to thinking about, I just said they're all the same, and yet George Purdom and Ken Ham are saying, look at the Great Dane and look at a Terrier. They're more different from one another. Well, what do they mean by more different? They're more different. In other words, from my eyeballs, they look more different. What I'm saying is if you dive in and you look at the genetics, and this would be true in the nuclear genome, you look at hundreds of genes, you look at the number of differences in their genomes. Domesticated dogs, they're all like carbon copies of one another. Their genomes are so similar to one another. It's like, well, if they're so similar, how do you get such big differences? Those are phenotypes. Phenotypes are generated by different genotypes. There can be just single individual changes in genotypes that create fairly significant changes in the external appearance of an organism, all right, developmentally especially. So you have a developmental gene with one small difference that can create early shutoff or termination of that development of that particular body part, creating a very different size and sometimes different shape. So long snout versus short snout and so forth. Those are all differences in terms of developmental timing. And so we human beings have simply, picked on little tiny mutations, sometimes original variation that was in the wolves. Now, George Purdom wants to say it's all original variation that God created. There's huge problems with that. I'm not going to go down that right now. But there's a huge number of, there has to be a large number of, there's many times where human beings have picked on just a few individual small changes in the genome, and we've accentuated that by artificially selecting, strongly selecting for that particular characteristic. And so hence we have pulled apart domesticated dogs and picked out our features that we really like, but their features are mostly external features. Right? And the external features are very deceptive with respect to internal features. Now, go back to my intro. I said that, when I see a flying squirrel, I've had a lot of flying squirrels in my attic and caught a lot of them, cute little buggers. But when I see a sugar glider from Australia, which I've not seen in person, but I've certainly seen, I have seen one in a zoo. They're very, very similar looking organisms, just on first blush. Now, if you dig in really fine detail into the external features, you'll find a lot of differences. But that's also true if you look at a dog and a coyote and a wolf, right? George Purdom's saying they're very similar, but if you start looking closely, you're going to find hundreds of differences, like many, many, many differences between those two. They're just not dramatic differences of huge size or different snouts or very different colorations or ears that stand up or don't stand up. By the way, not standing up, that is a mutation, having floppy ears. That's unique to domesticated dogs. All right. So when I look at that sugar glider and that flying squirrel, and you think they look very similar, you might be tempted to think they're both rodents and they're both very close relatives of one another. But then you find out, well, one's a marsupial and one's a placental. All right. So those are completely different groups of mammals. And so the placental or the marsupials living in Australia there, they have similar form, all right, and some features on the outside. But if you dig into like how they operate, their physiology, all right, their way in which they even reproduce is very different from one another. So if you added up all the differences between them, there'd be so many differences that you would realize that the external features end up just being a very minor bit of the totality of the organism in terms of who it is and what it is and how it operates. And this is the same thing with a coyote and a wolf. They may have some similar body style. They have different behaviors for sure. But they're going to have lots and lots of differences in terms of their internal physiology, and especially their genomes themselves are going to be much, much more divergent than any two dogs will be from one another. And this is the reason dogs are just considered breeds of coyotes, right? And that coyotes and wolves are considered distinctive from one another because they represent independent lineages, genetic lineages that have been independent for a long, long time. Hundreds of thousands of years to accumulate that much variation between them. Now, if it takes hundreds of thousands of years to accumulate that much variation between a coyote and a wolf, imagine how much time is needed to develop this amount of divergence between foxes and wolves. All right. Oh, yeah. So I've also created this figure for my blog as well. And I did comparisons of mitochondrial genomes. Mitochondrial genome is just kind of like a proxy. It's an easy way of looking at genetic divergence, kind of molecular clock between different organisms. And so you see like humans, chimpanzees, 1,462 differences between the typical chimpanzee genome and an average human genome. Humans and Neanderthals, 200 differences. So that's going to give you a little bit of a reference point there. But between any two people, the two most different people on Earth, 80 some differences, right? Between the two most divergent people on Earth. So now let's go down here and let's find dogs. So I did this comparison. Here's wolf and domesticated dog. Anywhere between 20 and 70 differences between wolves and domesticated dogs, mostly on the 20 end. What's the difference between a coyote and a domesticated dog? Right? Which is almost the same thing as saying a coyote and a wolf. About 700 differences. All right. So almost 10 times as many mutations or single nucleotide polymorphisms, variations. All right. 10 times as many between a wolf and a coyote as there is between, say, a wolf and a domesticated dog. Or among domesticated dogs themselves, only, say, 20 to 30 differences in total. What about a red fox and a wolf, which Georgia Purdom and Ken Ham both say are the same kind and have evolved from a common ancestor pair on Noah's Ark, right? Just two dogs. So one mitochondrial genome. That one mitochondrial genome in a red fox has 2,269 differences between that and the average wolf genome. And that doesn't include insertions and deletions. That's just single nucleotide changes, A to C, T to G. So there's even more differences when you add up the insertions and deletions, losses of bases, and additions of bases. All right, and if you want to scan down to find other comparisons, the difference between a polar bear and a panda bear, very different types of bears, that's similar. That's 2,500 differences. But between a brown bear and a polar bear, which are considered very similar species, and we know that they can hybridize too, 295 differences. So that's a little like the difference between Neanderthals and the human sequences. All right, so the point being here is that Georgia Purdom, when she talks about two domesticated dogs being more different from one another than wolves and coyotes, she can only be saying that if she's saying, if I just look at them, what I see looks more different. That's the only way she could be truthfully saying those words. And she doesn't qualify it. I went back and I listened. She does not qualify it as this is morphological difference or based on external appearances, or, she doesn't have any qualifier. It's just, these are more different. I read it to you. I showed you on those slides. One is more different than the other. More divergent even, uses the word divergent at times. Divergent is usually measured, we definitely measure that more in genetic divergence than we would in just morphological appearance. That's very hard to calculate. So because she doesn't qualify it, she's leading her audience to really believe that if human beings can isolate two different, morphologically different, very different looking dog breeds in just a few hundred years, then why can't other organisms in nature, which have more genetic diversity and more time, why can't they just turn into other species? She finds that to be a trivial thing. But no evolutionary biologist who studies population genetics and understands how long it takes to separate and segregate gene pools that still have tremendous amounts of diversity. That's the thing with the analysis I did. It's not like you took two things off the ark and then you separated and pulled them apart like you do breeds of dogs. And so they're really all genetically almost identical, but you just have sort of highlighted a few features that make them really look different. So you're like, is that what's happening in the natural world? No. Wolves and coyotes. Wolves have more genetic diversity between different wolves on this earth than do domesticated dogs. Right? So they're already more diverse, even though they look similar on the outside. And they presumably were separated from coyotes, which were then separated from wild dogs, which were separated from all these other 35 species. And if you listened to me before, over 200 different canines have been created from the original 2 dogs on the ark. Imagine how much you'd have to separate the gene pools into smaller and smaller and smaller groups of variation. And yet what I'm showing you is there's a huge amount of variation in all those species. A lot of variation. I think most population biologists would say they're full of variation. They don't look like they've lost their variation. And you can go back now with ancient DNA, we can go back and look at ancient dogs from thousands of years ago, or wolves from thousands of years ago, and coyotes from thousands of years ago. And you can see no, they're about as diverse back then as they are now. They're not losing their diversity. They're not changing in terms of their total amount of diversity. All right. So they have a huge amount of diversity, and yet they look externally very similar to each other. You might be asking, well, why is that? How does that happen? Part of that is what's called stabilizing selection. It's the environment says, look, this particular body plan, this particular look, all right, the external features of the organism are like color for blending into environment, or maybe reflecting light or absorbing light, depending on the environment. So if you live in a similar environment, that's going to sculpt the external features to have all the dogs look the same. Coyotes and wolves live in similar environments. You would expect them to have similar external features because they have to be adapted. They're going to have longer, shaggy coats, right? They have to have thicker hair because they're both living in cold environments in the winter. They're going to have similar jaws. They're going to have similar teeth and so forth because they're eating similar types of prey. All right, you can go down this long list and you see what natural selection does. It says you can't afford to have a crazy short legs and another one with really long legs and one with a little short snout where the tongue is hanging out. Those things are maladapted. Those are bad adaptations for living in a natural environment. So in the natural environment, organisms tend to be more similar, have external book covers, right? But the inner side, the insides of those books can be very different from one another. right, can be quite different from one another. They've accumulated a huge amount of genetic diversity that affects many, many, many different aspects of their physiology and behavior and all these other things that makes them diverse, very diverse, and also makes them highly divergent from one another, even if they look very similar. All right, so really quickly, because I've kind of gone on a lot longer than I thought, I've kind of made most of my points, but let's just take a look at this. I want to show you that other people have seen the same thing I have when I did my own analysis. And I wanted to show my own analysis to show that I'm not just reading this from a paper, but I can go into a genetic database, pull out data, and do the comparison myself and see. All right. Georgia Purdom should have the technology to do this as well. It took me a half hour to make that particular figure. In fact, I've even thought if anyone out there is interested, I'd be willing to make a video where I just do it in front of you. All right. I just show you how you would construct this, how I could do that comparison, how I'd pull out the sequences and so forth and get these particular results. But back to this. PLOS 1, 2013. All right. Public Library of Science article. Ancient DNA analysis affirms the canid from Altai as a primitive dog. And Altai is a southern province in Russia. And so this dog is thought to be about 33,000 years old. That's their dating of it. Now, Answers in Genesis is not going to accept 33,000 years, right? They're going to say at max, it can be 4,500 years old because that would be the end of the flood. And so this dog had to somehow get to this particular location. Now, what I'll say is really important about this paper is it's clearly found underneath layers of sediment that are from the Ice Age. Right, the most recent ice age. For Answers in Genesis, they believe there was an ice age several hundred years after the flood. And so I think the way they'd have to explain this particular canid, which they think is actually a domesticated dog or a very, very early domesticated dog, is that this dog had to have existed between the flood and the ice age. And so they would place this dog at 4,000 something years old. That's a problem already based on everything I've told you, right? Because I've shown that all domesticated dogs are very, very similar to each other genetically. And yet coyotes and wolves have a huge amount of mitochondrial diversity, which all had to have formed since the flood. And so if domesticated dogs have been around since 100 years after the flood, and they've been propagated for the last 4,000 years, we should see a similar amount of genetic diversity and genetic divergence in domesticated dog lineages than we do between coyotes and wolves, and between wolves and foxes, and between foxes and African wild dogs. And yet we don't see that. We do not see that at all. So this pattern of genetic diversity does not fit the creationist model in any way. Here's their little phylogeny in which they looked at a portion of the mitochondrial genome, just a small portion of it, not the whole thing. And they have small portions because they're looking at ancient dogs, right? They're looking at old samples of dogs that have been buried, basically semi-fossilized stuff, right? And they've extracted DNA from it. So you have coyotes down here, and that would be living coyotes. And then they have this little double hash. When you see a little double hash, that means there's so much difference. They couldn't put it all in the line that you can see on this page. This line goes way, way, way off in the distance, meaning there's a lot of genetic difference for this particular area of the mitochondrial genome and coyotes. And then you have some old world wolves, and then you have a group of OWWs, old world wolves. And this shows there's a bunch of different diversity in old world dogs. Wolves. And then interspersed in those wolves are a few different ancient lineages of what we think is domesticated dogs because of their proximity to human locations, human archaeological digs. Right. And they also seem to have some slightly different morphological features that are suggestive of the domestication process and how they've changed their anatomy somewhat in that process. But up in this other group is where a vast number of other domesticated dogs come from. And so there are Eastern Beringian wolves, a bunch of these, and this would be wolves that then would have been lived up in Russia, right? And eventually those Russian dogs could those dogs would have come with, or domesticated dogs from those could have come with people that first came over, the original Native Americans, into North America and South America. And you'll see pre-Columbian dogs. There are actually genetic samples of various domesticated dogs that are anywhere from hundreds to thousands of years old, that all clump together with Eastern bridging and wolves. And so that makes a nice case for sort of the domestication process in Russia, and then moving over into North America and South America. And then the Altai dog is right here, and that is this 30,000-year-old specimen, which is not very different from the pre-Columbian dogs. All right, so this is like saying, look, there's this dog that looks like it's one of the first things the oldest domesticated, looks like domesticated dog, and it's genetically very, very similar to these New World dogs, domesticated dogs. And then also in the supplemental information, I can't show you the whole figure, but it gives you the idea. Here we have coyotes down here, right, being genetically very, very distinct from the Tibetan wolves. And then we've got, these are old world wolves, and then you have all of these are dogs. All right, all these are dogs. So this little line right here is saying, like, there's a whole group of dogs right here that are genetically really similar to one another, and they're on a little short line of a couple differences. And so they seem to all have evolved from like possibly a different old world wolf. And then this group might have come from yet a different old world wolf. And this goes back to the whole debate about, did domestication happen one time in one place and every single domesticated dog is related to each other? That seems to be that particular idea seems to be waning, because we're getting more and more genetic evidence that there are domesticated dogs that are more similar to some lineages of wolves than they are to other lineages of wolves. And then there's another domesticated dog in another part of the world that's more similar to a different set of wolves. And so the domestication process could happen several times. But all from a particular set or group of wolves that was fairly closely related to one another, because all the domesticated dogs pretty much have the same mitochondrial genome. All right, so if you zoom in, there are a couple dogs here. There are these ancient dogs, and then here's a whole bunch of dogs again, and these are wolves. All right, so again, illustrates that dogs are just wolves. That seems pretty clear, and you could do this with nuclear data as well. Most nuclear genes, especially genes that are what we call housekeeping genes, things that all organisms use, the sequences of a domesticated dog are going to be virtually the same as a sequence from a wolf. Now, those same those same housekeeping genes, so these are like genes everybody uses all the time and every mammal has, but we don't all have the same sequence. So if you look at a coyote, they'll have some differences between wolves. And if you look at foxes, they're going to have even more differences in those particular genes, even though the gene is performing exactly the same function. So there's another case where you could even look at the molecules. You could say, based on what they're doing, they look like they're doing exactly the same thing. But if you look under the hood and you look at like, what is the code that makes them do what they do? The code's different. So the code is very different in a fox versus a wolf. The code is not as different between a wolf and a coyote. This is all consistent with the idea of a common ancestor, right? Just the different ages of common ancestors. The more recently you have a common ancestor, the less likely you're going to have big differences in these housekeeping genes for these sequences or the codes for them. And so those are the patterns that we're seeing here. So if I could just circle back to Georgia Purdom. All right, so here again, she presents to her audience gray wolves and coyotes. Look, they're just like the same thing. They're not that different. But I'll acknowledge that they're different species. They don't usually mate with one another, which is really important criteria for her. And that somehow, there's not that many differences other than they can't mate in her mind. And yet we can make these incredible differences between dogs. And so she just doesn't see how it could be that hard to make a gray wolf versus a coyote. But I'm telling you that you couldn't just take a gray wolf and extract a coyote from that through several easy steps. They have so many differences in so many different genes, right? And distributed across a large population, that the process of separating those populations enough that they don't have gene flow and constantly mix their genes, and then have each one of those gene pools evolve thousands upon thousands upon thousands, right? There's just in the mitochondrial genome alone, there's 700 differences between a coyote and a wolf. So somehow you had to have isolation of those groups and 700 differences. So 350 mutations in gray wolves, 350 mutations in coyotes had to have occurred before the present so we could see these differences between these two groups. And just to reiterate, you don't see those differences in domesticated dogs, all right? But that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? There's going to be hundreds of thousands of differences in the genetic code between the average set of genetic characteristics in a wolf and the average genome of a coyote, right? Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of differences. I would say there's probably well over 1 million, but let's be conservative. Those don't just appear overnight. And even if Georgia Purdom wants to say that, well, these two species came from another species, an ancestor, that had enormous genetic differences among the individuals. And so those individuals just kind of like separated from each other, and that gave you two pools of huge amount of differences. That doesn't work for the mitochondrial genome, right? And it doesn't work for the Y chromosome, where there's also a very large number of differences. This really doesn't work in the sense that we don't have any evidence that the ancestor had twice as much variation in the population. Gray wolves and coyotes have significant amounts of variation in their populations, and there's nothing that leads anyone to believe that in the past they had more than they do today, or a substantial amount more than they have today, or that really any organism that's fairly diverse had much more diversity in the past. And I'm going to risk it. I'm going to risk being really repetitive and go back to Noah's Ark and just remind you that if there were two animals there, there's only so much diversity two animals can hold. And they had to spawn off 200 or more species of canines, each of which has its own distinct characteristics. And as I'm showing you now, it's not just that they have distinct characteristics like Great Danes and Terriers have from each other. Like, oh, look, we can just make a Terrier and a Great Dane. You know, we could just make 35 of those variants. No. Each one of those species itself has an enormous amount of variation between individuals within the population. So you have to hold all that variation in those original two animals. And you have to do it for 200 or more species. And they all probably had an enormous amount of diversity at one point or another in the lifespan of that particular species. Foxes especially, red foxes, there's like 17 different sub-varieties of foxes. And there's a much more genetic diversity between different foxes than there are between even great wolves, which I consider a fairly diverse species itself. All right, so Ken Ham, Georgia Purdom, present a message to their audience that, look, you can see how one organism can become multiple different, very distinct things over a very short period of time. And they act like they can do an apples to apples comparison. Like this Great Dane is very similar to this other, like a species. And maybe species can also split just as quickly. This is coming nowhere close to making that case by saying this. But I think it's an extremely effective message, which is why they continue to use it, right? They're fantastic politicians. They use the data available, knowing what their audience doesn't know, because any biologist who has studied any of the stuff to any extent should easily be able to pick out that this is nonsense that they're saying, that they're talking about. But their typical audience doesn't know that, and they see just what you and I see when you look at this image. They're just like kids going to the zoo, and the zookeeper is saying, look at these really interesting animals. Look at these two animals over here. They're really different from one another. They're not telling you, yeah, they look really different, but they're actually the same species. They're really two different varieties of the same kind of thing. We're just like making our displays look really different and tricking you into thinking there's lots of variation here when there really isn't. So that's what Canine and Ham is doing. And Georgia Purdom in this talk. She's over there in Sweden, and she's presenting to probably a whole bunch of like homeschool kids and parents and showing them these pictures and making it sound like, don't let those evolutionists fool you into thinking you need hundreds of thousands of years to make these changes. You don't need 500,000 years to change an ancestor into a wolf and a coyote. And they're even cheating there too. Ken Ham says, oh, look, it takes, evolutionists are saying it takes thousands of years. Now it's hundreds of thousands of years is the claim for most of these species that have this kind of variation. And don't get fooled by Georgia Purdom when she turns around and she gives some examples of recent speciation, like, oh, there's these two things, and they just recently, over the last 40 years, we've seen how they've changed and they become a new species. Most of those species aren't species like we're talking about here, right? We're not talking about species like a coyote, where it has an enormous amount of genetic variation. Usually those new species are a small number of individuals starting a new population that has a distinctive characteristic that maybe separates them from their original species, their parental species, so that they become incompatible with them. And so we, by definition, would say they're new species. But that new species is not going to have an enormous genetic gene pool to draw upon and to be able to adapt and so forth in their environment. It's going to take them a long time of persisting and developing mutations before they develop the type of genetic diversity that, say, a coyote population has, all right, across North America. And so they're not equivalent species. Just because some species can form in 40 or 50 years and we can see it happen, which is still extremely rare, just because we can see that happen, it doesn't mean that that is an apples to apples comparison to the origin of all other species that we see. Right? And again, Georgia Purdom absolutely should know this, right? And if she doesn't know it, she can certainly figure it out very quickly by doing a little bit of reading and doing her own analysis, right? Finding out just how diverse coyotes and wolves are, and then asking how diverse Great Danes and Yorkshire Terriers are, and how that diversity could come about, and whether it's realistic to expect Great Danes and Yorkshire Terriers to have as much genetic diversity as they appear to have in terms of morphological diversity. So I can't remember if there's anything else I wanted to say. I just, here we just see Ken Ham and Georgia Purdom being overly simplistic in an analysis where they're simply looking at organisms as if their book covers represent their whole being. And, I remember there was something else I did want to say. I find this sort of ironic. Georgia Purdom and Ken Ham are both very outspoken about human genetic diversity and how you can't read a book by its cover. And there, what they mean is you can't look at an individual and look at how different they look on the outside and believe that they're divergent from other individuals, right? We're all one human race. We're all, as they would say, one blood, all right? So they'd look at skin color and they would say, skin color is only skin deep. It's based on just a few very small genetic differences that accumulate to make these different skin colors, right? And hair and other things, these are all minor individual genetic traits, and yet inside genetically, we're all very similar. And there, I agree. They've actually got it right there, right? Human beings, in terms of our genetics, in terms of the way we operate internally, the actual differences between us are very minor, right? And we're like Great Danes and Yorkshire Terriers, right? We're all one species. And there's a few individual alleles or variants of genes that make enormous differences in maybe our external physical appearance. And yet internally, two people that might have the same skin color, all right, might actually be genetically more divergent from it. So for my example, I might look at, me and someone else and think we look quite similar to one another based just on our external appearance. But we might have two very different mitochondrial genomes. Actually, I'm pretty sure I do have a very different mitochondrial genome because my mitochondrial genome is D41, which is Native American or Beringian. All right, it's from either Asia or South America, North America, but ancient, right? Old lineage. So it's not Western European like most of the rest of my genome is. All right, so, okay, sorry, a little tangent there. You can't look at two people that look morphologically similar to each other and assume that their internal physiology is the same. Like, okay, I'm going to give you, because this drug worked on you, I'm going to give this drug to you because it should also work on you because you look the same. No, not necessarily. I might have very different alleles for a bunch of other things inside, right? We just happen to share just a few minor alleles, a minor number of alleles that give us a similar external appearance, right? They talk about this, right, all the time. They're constantly harping on the fact that we should not be judging people by their external looks and that we're all very similar to one another, right? We're all, I don't want to be, we're all super similar to one another. We're like Great Danes and Yorkshire Terriers, very similar to one another. We're not gray wolves and coyotes, right? Now, I would say gray wolves and coyotes are, they're more different, quite a bit more different than a Neanderthal and a human being. All right, so they're more closer to the range of a chimpanzee and a human, right? So, and you wouldn't hear Ken Ham or Georgia Purdom going around like, look at this gray wolf and coyote. They're very, very similar to each other. In fact, they're as similar to each other as chimpanzees and human beings, right? They do see something much more in overall divergence. What do they mean by how different we are? If they're talking to human beings, they're talking a whole different language. And it's actually a much more appropriate language to think about all the different kinds of things that divergence or difference means. And then when they go and look at something like these dogs or any other mammals, and they're talking about evolution and speciation rates and how can we fit and understand all this in a creationist model, all of a sudden it's like we only look at books by their covers. And we just look at them and go like, those are the same, those are different. It makes no sense. It's completely the opposite approach. As I said, it's kind of ironic that they should be able to, maybe it's not irony, maybe it's sad. Maybe it's just sad that they really know that they shouldn't be using this language with respect to canines. But it is what the audience will swallow, right? And it helps alleviate concerns. It makes the story simple. But, life isn't simple. And even if something is complex for you, maybe you can't explain it well, or maybe it doesn't have an explanation, which is an anathema to Answers in Genesis, because it's like answers, right? We have answers to everything. If this is the best answer they can come up with, is to make this kind of excuse for why speciation isn't a problem for young earth creationism, well, then it's based on a lie, right? It's founded on a lie, right? A very effective lie, but that's why I call it, they're very effective politicians. They can lie with ease, knowing that this is for the good of everybody, if they just believe this. Right? That way they won't be tempted. They won't be tempted by other philosophies and ideas because they'll just believe this, and that's keeping them safe. And so lies become good things. Lies become ways of comfort for some people. All right, now I have expended everything I think I can say about these 3 slides from Georgia Purdom's presentation. All right, that's it. Till next time, I'm going to get back to doing some This Week in Creationism, and when my semester ends, I have some more scripted productions which will cover some specific topics, including trying to get a little bit more into some of the theology behind some of these problems versus just talking about the scientific issues. With that, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.